We're back again for part 2 of our fat chapter. The previous video, in the first video, I had some technological problems and it just kicked me off. But here's where we ended off. We ended off talking about the regulation of fat and carbohydrate metabolism. First of all, I just noticed something. The top title to this says Module 6 Carbohydrates, but it really is fats, so it's just mislabeled. Sorry. So we began talking about regulation. Because we burn a carb-fat mixture almost all of the time, our muscles burn that for energy. Some differences in how carbohydrate metabolism is regulated. It's more tightly regulated. It's more directly related to the energy need of our muscles, as compared to fat metabolism, which is not as tightly regulated. One of the factors is just because it's harder to do. There's more steps. And we talked about, we think that more of the regulating factors are fat availability, not necessarily how much adipose we have, but how much of that adipose we can break down, transport in the bloodstream, and get to the muscle. And then, of course, fat metabolism seems to be tied to carbohydrate metabolism. This is where we left off. One of the more recent theories in the last 10 years or so is that carbohydrate metabolism is really a key influencer on fat metabolism, which means that our body regulates this first and then regulates this second based on how much fuel we were able to get from carbohydrates. But we still have a lot to learn about this, so I wouldn't be surprised if we learn more, and I hope that we do, and it becomes clearer. All right, so what are the take-home points? Carbohydrates remain the first fuel we go to. And remember, think back to the carbohydrates chapter. Remember, our central nervous system can only metabolize carbohydrates. So in that way, carbohydrates are an essential fuel source. If our body can regulate and maintain proper carbohydrate metabolism, that's the number one goal. And then for fats, like I said before, we seem to regulate fats kind of secondary to carbohydrates. All right, now, just like we did with the carbohydrates chapter, in this fat chapter, we're going to talk about dietary fat needs, the days leading up to, before, during, and after exercise. We're going to be using our same 3 sample athletes: our powerlifter, our team athlete, and our ultra endurance Ironman triathlete. So here's our outline. We're going to talk about when fat is used as fuel, when we might need to ingest fat during exercise, how much we should be ingesting fat in our day-to-day diet, and then we'll touch upon some supplements that claim that they increase fat oxidation, but do they really? We're going to find out. Okay, you've seen this chart before. You don't have to know the specifics, but what it points out is that we are always burning, pretty much always, a carb-fat mixture. At the initial, very beginning of exercise, we're burning carbs only, but we're going to start to burn fat as quickly as we can. So really, we never, I can't think of an instance where I've seen it, we never burn fat alone. We're always burning fat along with carbohydrates to keep our muscle cells fueled. Okay, this is talking about how our muscles utilize fat for energy. At rest, we're able to have some fat being oxidized from the fatty acids in the adipose tissue, but it's not very much. I am not going to ask you the specific number. It's just there to show you that it's not very much. At rest, we burn a little bit of fat, but not very much. However, at the onset of exercise, your body will begin the steps of fat metabolism. So even though we burn a little bit at rest, it's really very, very minimal. But at onset of exercise, begin steps to metabolize fats, more fats. So think back to those 6 steps that we talked about. What was the first step? Lipolysis. When we have to break down the triglyceride into the fatty acids. And what happens is at the very onset of exercise, our actual blood fatty acid concentration goes down. And this is because of this point. Okay? When we start exercise, if I could draw like a little stick figure running, let's see. Running! Okay, I'm really bad. But when we begin running and we look at the muscles of our runner, here's what a muscle looks like, right? Our muscles, let me put up here, bloodstream. And then here we have our adipose tissue. When we begin to exercise, the muscles are going to be taking whatever fatty acids are available in the blood, they're going to suck them up. And the muscles suck up those fatty acids so quickly that they suck them up before the adipose fatty acids are able to replace this. So there's a period of time where our blood concentration of fatty acids actually goes down. This isn't a huge point, but I think it's a good example of some physiology for us to have a basic understanding of. So let me say that again. At rest, we burn a teeny tiny bit of fat. But when we start to exercise, we're going to start the steps of fat metabolism fast. And what's the first step of fat metabolism? Lipolysis, where the triglycerides break down to fatty acids. That is this process, right? Let's see. Lipolysis is this process, taking the triglycerides from our fat cells and converting them into fatty acids. That process is going to start, but it takes a little bit of time. And because at the onset of exercise, our muscles are going to uptake whatever fatty acids are available in the blood, this happens so quickly. Our uptake of fatty acids into the muscle happens more quickly than what can be replaced through lipolysis. So what that means is for a relatively short period of time, there's a drop in fatty acid concentration in the bloodstream. But it's not a huge deal because we still are metabolizing mostly carbohydrates. So this is the benefit of having multiple fuel sources. And about, 15 minutes or so, the rate of lipolysis is going to catch up and our fatty acid amount in the blood will recover. What are some things to know about fat oxidation rates? As our exercise duration goes on, the longer you exercise continuously, the more fat you are going to oxidize. Part of that is just because our muscles like to burn fat because it gives us more energy per gram. We wonder if part of the impetus for this higher fat oxidation rate is due to a drop in muscle glycogen. But either way, it's a simple principle. When we exercise for a longer duration, we're going to oxidize more fat. Let's check it out. At low intensity, high duration activity, this should be an up arrow, fat oxidation actually increases. At moderate intensity, it begins to decrease. I'm sorry, I said that wrong. At low intensity, oh dear, maybe I had too much vodka with lunch. That's not true, not true. At lower intensity, we burn more fat. At higher intensity, we burn much less fat. And at much higher intensities, we're going to rely more on carbs. Okay, cool. So a couple of things about fat metabolism. When our exercise duration is longer, we burn more fat. When the intensity of the exercise is lower, we burn more fat. And we're talking about this because you need to be thinking about your exercise. Think about the intensity and the duration of the exercise that you do. Because if you consider the intensity and duration of your exercise, and we know what fuel is used for all these different scenarios, then you can better match your dietary intake to what's being burned. So for example, I tend to be more of an endurance, so I'm at a lower intensity, but higher duration. So for me, I know that fat is going to be a major fuel source. I don't need to be eating hamburgers and hot dogs and ice cream all the time, but I do need to have some healthy fats. And it may seem counterproductive because endurance athletes tend to be really skinny, but in terms of fueling your muscles, you need to bring in some healthy fats. On the other hand, if you're a 100-meter sprinter like Usain Bolt, you're going to be needing to bring in carbs and maybe less fat. Okay, good. All right. When we do studies and we put people on a treadmill and we put the little gas apparatus on their mouth that we talked about in a previous chapter, indirect calorimetry, and we're able to measure the oxygen they breathe in and the carbon dioxide they breathe out, we're able to get their respiratory exchange ratio. Oh my God, let's review. Remember, the volume of carbon dioxide we exhale divided by the volume of oxygen we inhale, considered our respiratory exchange ratio or our respiratory quotient. Remember, at an RER of 1.0, our muscles are using 100% carbs. Remember, at 0.85 RER, we're burning 50-50 carbs and fat. Well, this is how we do studies. We look at the RER to see what nutrient the muscles are burning for energy. And what we find is that we have the most fat oxidation at a moderate intensity, about 60%. That would make sense, folks. VO2 max is your maximal aerobic capacity. So a 100-meter sprinter is probably working at 90-95% of their max VO2, and they're relying mostly on carbs. But at a more moderate intensity, we're going to be using most fat. Have an idea about this percentage. And when I say moderate intensity, 60% of a VO2 max isn't necessarily like easy, but it's still considered moderate when you consider what your ceiling could be for intensity, which is usually higher than we want to exercise. There's some other considerations. Let's talk about these. Effects of training. With endurance training, you burn more fat. So with endurance training, we're able to burn more fat. This is a physiological adaptation where all those steps of fat metabolism, lipolysis, then taking those fatty acids into the bloodstream, and then transporting the fatty acids on a carrier protein to the muscle, and then bringing the fatty acids into the muscle, into the mitochondria using carnitine, and then going through beta oxidation. As we endurance train, those pathways become a little bit more efficient. So well-trained endurance athletes will be able to burn more fats, and that's a good thing because then we get more energy. Higher fat diets do increase our fat oxidation. I'm going to touch upon this a little bit later because what's popular right now is the ketogenic diet. And the exact premise of the ketogenic diet is if I bring in more carbs and less fat, it forces my muscles to burn more fat. And when we do studies on well-trained athletes, when they limit their carb intake and increase their fat, and we're talking about healthy fats for the most part, they do burn more fat. But, a little preview to our discussion later, studies haven't shown that this leads to an increased performance. So just because your rate of fat oxidation may go up, it hasn't really shown that their performance is better. So it's one thing to have a high fat oxidation rate, but if it's not leading to better performance, then what good is it? One of the reasons why this might be is because, as we said before, fat oxidation doesn't always directly link with amount of fat available to the muscle. Another thing is when you are exercise training on a high-fat, low-carb diet, you do not have as much energy, folks, because you're limiting your carbs. So when you have this diet, you can't train as hard. And when you can't train as hard, we're not seeing some of the muscle adaptations that are needed to improve performance. Another thing to consider is when you ingest a lot of carbs, it releases a hormone called insulin, as we talked about in the carbohydrate chapter. And insulin actually reduces lipolysis. It reduces converting dietary fat in the adipose into fatty acids that can then go to the muscle. So it's kind of like you can't always have the best of both worlds. So it's always a balance. All right. So all this information, is it bad or good? And this big point I want to take here is the first one. Sometimes we see a decrease in fat oxidation during exercise. Part of that is because initially there's less lipolysis happening. Remember, because the muscle uptake of the blood fatty acids happens so quickly, and it takes steps. Remember, there's so many steps. Fat takes a long time. So just because you see an immediate drop in fat oxidation, it's not always bad. There's a little bit of a time lag until the steps of fat metabolism can catch up. And in the meantime, we can burn glucose and glycogen. Sometimes we don't want to burn fat. Sometimes it's not worth it for your body to take all the energy to break down fat. So sometimes we can rely on mostly glucose and glycogen and be just fine. The body only metabolizes the amount of fat that it needs, so it doesn't really plan ahead, which is different from glycogen. You know, it's very convenient that we have these glycogen stores right in the skeletal muscle. We don't have that with fats. And still, carbohydrates remain the primary driver. And a lot of fat metabolism kind of is responsive or dependent on how many carbs we're burning. Okay, fat ingestion during exercise. Well, how might this help? Potentially, if we bring in fats during exercise, maybe we burn more fats. Maybe we spare some glycogen for later. However, most studies show no benefit. Many studies show a negative effect because fat just takes too long to metabolize. So in most exercise durations, you're not exercising long enough to get through all those steps of fat metabolism to really receive a benefit from it. I do want to talk about, let me see here. Okay. Do I have a slide coming up here? All right. Before we frame this conversation even more, I do want to talk about what kind of athlete might actually benefit from fat during exercise, or what kind of athlete might actually even consider fat during exercise. And we're talking about what I'm going to consider ultra endurance. These are really the only people, if you're exercising, I don't know, 3 to 4 hours plus. These are really the only people that would even consider bringing in fat during exercise. Remember, carbohydrates, you should ingest some carbohydrates during activity if it is approximately 60 minutes or more in continuous duration. And that's great, but the only time we would really consider fat maybe would be our ultra endurance athletes, because first of all, they rely more on fat because they're exercising for longer at a lower intensity, and because that exercise duration is potentially enough time for that athlete to actually, their body to go through the steps of metabolism for it to be a benefit. Okay, so let's talk about that ultra endurance athlete. Let's talk about our Ironman athlete, Matthew McCormack, right? I think his winning time, and again, this is kind of old, his winning time was between 8 and 9 hours for the Ironman, which is fantastic. Nope, it's not plus, it's 8 to 9 hours. If this Ironman athlete is considering bringing in some fats during exercise, we can look at different types of dietary fatty acids. We have long chain fatty acids in foods. We have medium chain fatty acids. And yeah, those are our, let's see. Yeah. So we'll focus on these two. Sorry for going ahead, just making sure I'm being consistent. Long chain fatty acids are longer in their chain, so they're more complex in structure. They are going to reach the blood circulation more slowly. By the way, this is the most common type of fatty acid. A medium chain fatty acid is a little bit simpler in structure and therefore enters the bloodstream more quickly. So potentially, if this Ironman athlete was considering bringing in some fat during exercise, potentially the medium chain fatty acids would be better. However, as I'm saying this, we really don't have a lot of scientific data that shows ingestion of fat during exercise helps. I've done the Ironman 3 times, and I will tell you a little bit of fat for me it took 14 hours. A little bit of fat over 14 hours tastes really good. You can only drink or ingest carbohydrates for so long. So I think anecdotally, which just means what people say, their own experiences are, you might find some athletes that benefit from this. But it's my job to tell you about the scientific data, whether it's there or not. So like I said, there's anecdotal evidence that is positive. A little bit of fat for a really, really long endurance. Maybe some trail mix, wouldn't that taste good? It's salty, a little bit of fat, some carbs. But again, that doesn't mean that it's necessarily scientific. So for my ultra endurance athletes out there, trial and error. Other research does support the use of the medium chain fatty acids along with carbohydrates. A couple references that I've read would recommend a ratio of 5-to-1, where you would have 5 parts carbohydrate to 1 part medium chain fatty acid. I'm not going to ask you this ratio specifically, but I guess what I'd like you to, the take-home message is, some research does show that medium chain fatty acids may help, but other research says it doesn't help. So like I said, this would only be pertinent for our ultra endurance athletes. Here are some examples of foods that contain medium chain fatty acids. Some dairy, depending on what type. I mentioned that Chris McCormack used to drink Ensure on his bike ride. It worked for him. It's a little bit too much dairy for me, which kind of upsets my stomach. But again, trial and error. It seems to benefit athletes to limit saturated fats. Athletes should be ingesting more of the unsaturated fats. And of course, it's good to have the omega-3 fatty acids, things that are found in, for example, salmon. So if we're talking about during exercise, maybe fats, and if you do, try and use the medium chain. In our overall diet, it's really just having a well-balanced diet, folks. Okay? All right. Here are some examples. You do not have to know these. All that I want to remind you of is that the long-chain fatty acids are most common. So obviously, in your everyday food, you're going to be having a lot of long-chain fatty acids. But it's no big deal, because if you're not eating it right before activity, then you're going to have plenty of time for your body to digest, absorb, and metabolize. Medium chains would be the best during, potentially. So that's what we think currently. And then you can see some of the short chain fatty acids. All right, so I wanted to give you some examples of foods that an athlete might be ingesting before, during, or after an event. And I wanted to pull out some of the ingredients. So if we look at this Clif Bar, you can see that there's flaxseed, almonds, and almond butter. And they would be these type of fatty acids, which are more long chain. Is that bad? No. During the Ironman, when I finish the bike, I love to have some bites of a Clif Bar. It sits well in my stomach. I still have the marathon to run, which is many, many, many hours, so I got plenty of time. Maybe in a shorter endurance event, this may not be best, because it's long chain, not medium chain. But also, it's just about trial and error. This is an example of what I like to eat during an Ironman, and we're all different. I like to eat these Ritz peanut butter sandwiches because it contains carbs, and the cracker contains salt, which is really good to replenish the sodium that I'm losing when I sweat. And that peanut butter, it just breaks up the monotony of all the Gatorade and the goos and the sugar. So I brought the label here. You can see that there's soybean oil, which contains these 2 fatty acids, which are also long-chain fatty acids. So as you can see, in foods, it's most common to have long-chain fatty acids. Okay, we are winding down here. Thanks for sticking around. There are some supplements that specifically aim to those medium-chain fatty acids. So we could say, well, from a theoretical and physiological standpoint, because these contain the medium chain fatty acids, which we believe to be the best to ingest during activity, you could see that these are on the right track in terms of how things might work. What I will say to you though is, as of now, from what I've read, because these types of supplements are going to claim to increase your fat oxidation. They're going to claim that when you take these supplements, you're going to burn more fat. And this could be good for an athlete to potentially free more fatty acids to the muscle. But a lot of this is geared towards weight loss. So if someone is trying to get a quick fix, I'll just take some medium chain fatty acid supplements. It's going to help me burn more fat, and I may lose more weight. But to my knowledge, these do not lose weight. They do not scientifically cause you to lose weight. And in my research, they do not help performance. Okay, so the amount of fat that you take in matters, and the types of fat that you take in matters. Really, just be well balanced with it, folks. A well-balanced fat intake overall is really the best thing. If you're an endurance athlete, we talked about that range of 20 to 35% of your diet coming from fats. If I'm an ultra endurance athlete, I'm going to edge up because I know my muscles are going to be burning more fat. But I have to really be careful that it's well balanced, that it's lean meats with healthy fats, because I don't want to add excess adipose, increase my weight overall. I just want to have enough adipose to fuel my activity. Right before activity, you wouldn't want to eat fat. Right after activity, you wouldn't want to eat fat. But an hour, maybe 2 hours before, 2 hours after, include some healthy fats. Okay. We're basically going to summarize what I already said, but we're going to be a little bit more specific. The effects of the day-to-day diet is to have enough fat and to make sure that our body is getting more efficient at the steps of fat metabolism. Because if we have enough fat going to the muscles, we can spare glycogen. That's the ideal situation. You have enough healthy fats, you have enough lipolysis, you have enough ability to metabolize fat, to keep the muscles with the fat that they want, and that will give them a lot of energy, and it will also decrease or spare glycogen. Think about this. If you're doing an endurance event, let's say you're riding your bike, you're cycling, and then you come up to a big hill. Well, your intensity is going to go up. So when my intensity goes up, I'm going to have to convert back to burning glycogen. So it's really good if we can have sufficient fats to spare glycogen so that the glycogen is there when we need it. Here are some specific diets that athletes have considered. I've already been a proponent of a well-balanced diet, well-balanced fat. But here are some more specific ideas. Let's run through them. Fasting. This has become less in favor, particularly right before an event. I would not recommend this. Some people thought, and to some extent it's true, if you don't bring in as much glucose, which is what we have most of, because our food is mostly going to be carbs anyway. If you don't have as many carbs, it's going to increase the availability of fats to use as fuel. If your muscles don't have as much carbs to metabolize, they're going to automatically go to fat. But it really decreases performance. I would not recommend this. Some people in their day-to-day, maybe 2 months before their event, some people like to fast for a day or two, and their body responds well to that. I'm not a big proponent of fasting, but in terms of every day, if you're not training hard and it works for you and you do it in a safe way, okay, fine. But for an athlete who's training hard, definitely not. Some people have tried a short-term ketogenic diet, meaning that kind of similar to carbohydrate loading, but fat loading. The idea would be, if I bring in more fat right before, then I've got more fat to burn. But it really doesn't help performance. It actually hurts performance. Right before an event, you should be focusing most on carbs. A long-term higher fat diet would be akin to a keto diet. It does seem to increase our fat oxidation. I have a question mark here because to what extent, we don't know, but it does seem over a longer term, if you have more fat in your diet, your rates of fat oxidation, fat metabolism will go up. But, as I said before, athletes that do this, and there have been some outstanding scientific studies on this by people that are really well respected in the field. Athletes that are on this keto diet for a long period of time, they actually do oxidize more fat. But we really haven't seen a clear path to where oxidizing more fat increases your performance. So as I said before, just because you have more fat, just because you have higher fat oxidation rates, doesn't necessarily mean that all of that is getting down to the muscle and that it's increasing your performance. And as I said before, another reason why performance is perhaps not enhanced is because while you're training on a lower carb diet, you just can't train at high of intensities. And you need to train at high intensities to see those muscle physiological adaptations. Okay, summarizing, carbs should remain what we eat most of. We need a moderate fat diet. Think about that range and think about where you might fall. Choose more healthy fats than not healthy fats. Does that mean you should have no healthy fats? No. I love myself some cookies, but I try and limit the intake. No significant change to your overall diet is needed right before or right after. Okay, so the meal 2 hours before, have a little bit of fat, just like you would in any other meal. The meals 2 hours after activity, have a little bit of fat, just like you normally would. Okay, last part here before we finish things off. We already talked about the medium chain fatty acid supplement. Let's talk about some other supplements that claim they can increase fat oxidation. We're going to talk more about this later in this course when we have entire chapters on these ergogenic aids. It has been proposed that caffeine will stimulate lipolysis. I have not seen that there's a scientific study that shows it impacts performance in a positive way. I mentioned carnitine. Remember, that's the enzyme that allows the fatty acids to enter the mitochondria. The theory behind this is great, but I really haven't seen solid evidence showing that it works to improve performance yet. And another one we talk about is pyruvate. This happens to be another enzyme involved in nutrient metabolism. We didn't talk about it, but it's another enzyme that if we have more of this enzyme, we could potentially burn more fat. But I have not seen studies that show that that improves performance either. We might find out that they do. Right now, we just don't have information that shows that it does. All right, we are all done with fats. I'll see you in the next chapter for proteins.